The night my father stood up from the dinner table and pointed at me, I knew something irreversible had finally cracked. The air inside my dining room felt thick, almost damp, like it was pressing against my chest. My sister sat to his left, quiet, composed, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She did not need to say a word. Her confidence said everything. This was already decided. I was only there to receive the order. My father's voice was steady, not loud, which somehow made it worse. He did not ask. He did not explain. He looked straight at me and said, "From now on, you take care of her." The words landed like a verdict. Not a request, not a discussion, a command. My sister finally looked up, a faint smile touching the corner of her mouth, the kind people wear when they know the outcome favors them. I waited for the familiar rush of panic, the tightening in my throat, the instinct to explain myself, to soften the moment, to fix it. But none of that came. Instead, there was a strange calm, almost unsettling in its clarity. I realized this was not the first time my life had been rearranged for someone else's convenience. It was just the first time I could see it clearly. I was Claire Anderson, 29 years old, sitting at a table inside the house I had bought on my own, being told what my future would look like by people who had never asked what it had cost me to build it. I had always been the reliable one, the daughter who answered her phone, the sister who stepped in. While others chased excitement or escaped consequences, I stayed grounded. I worked steadily, saved carefully, and bought my home without help. That house was not just a place to sleep, it was proof. Proof that I could stand on my own without borrowing, without begging, without leaning on anyone. That night, as my father spoke, I understood that none of that mattered to him. In his eyes, my stability was not something to respect. It was a resource to be used. My sister's bankruptcy had been framed as a tragedy, a sudden collapse no one could have predicted. That was the story I had been told, the one repeated to me until I felt cruel for questioning it. She had lost everything, they said. She needed time. She needed support. And because I had a house, because I had savings, because I had managed not to fall apart, the responsibility landed on me. When she first moved in, it was described as temporary. A few weeks, a short reset. I remember standing in my kitchen listening to my father explain it as if the decision had already been approved somewhere above me. I remember the familiar pressure in my chest as I nodded, even though every instinct warned me that this was not a small favor. It was a door I would not be able to close easily. That door had been wide open for months now. By the time of that dinner, my sister no longer acted like a guest. She did not hover on the edges of my life, grateful and careful. She settled in as if the house had always been hers. She rearranged routines, occupied space, and spoke with the ease of someone who expected to stay. When she looked at me across the table that night, there was no apology in her expression, only certainty. My father continued explaining what he expected, how this was family, how sacrifices had to be made. His words wrapped obligation in the language of love, a technique I had grown up with. Disagreeing meant being selfish. Setting boundaries meant being ungrateful. And refusing outright meant becoming the problem. I noticed something else then, something small but telling. No one asked how long this arrangement would last. No one mentioned an end point. The word temporary had quietly disappeared, and in its place stood an assumption. This was my role now. I looked around the table and felt a distance open inside me. Not anger, not sadness, distance. For the first time, I saw the pattern without emotion blurring it. I was not being asked to help. I was being assigned. My father waited for my response, clearly expecting resistance or reluctant agreement. Either would have satisfied him. What he did not expect was my silence. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I did not even defend myself. I simply met his gaze and nodded once. That nod sealed their confidence. My sister relaxed. My father leaned back slightly, as if the matter had been resolved. In their minds, the night ended exactly as it always had, with me absorbing the weight and them walking away lighter. But something fundamental had shifted. While they believed they had tightened their grip, I felt it loosen. Their certainty became my cover. Their assumption became my advantage. As I cleared the table later that evening, moving through my own kitchen like a guest in my own life, I understood something that frightened and steadied me at the same time. If I stayed, this would never end. There would always be another crisis, another demand, another reason why my needs came last. I washed the plates, dried my hands, and stood alone in the quiet that followed. Upstairs, my sister settled into comfort. Somewhere beyond these walls, a life waited for me that did not require permission. I did not argue that night because arguing would have changed nothing. I did not refuse because refusal would have brought consequences I was no longer afraid of. Instead, I listened, I observed, and I let them believe they had won. That was the moment everything began to turn, even if no one else at that table could see it yet. 3 months earlier, my life had been quiet in a way I had learned to treasure. Not exciting, not dramatic, just steady. I worked long days, came home to a house that felt like mine, and slept through the night without my phone lighting up with emergencies that were never really mine to solve. That sense of stability was fragile, though. I just did not know it yet. The call came well after midnight. I remember the glow of my phone on the nightstand and the dull resistance in my body as I reached for it. I already knew who it would be before I saw the name. My sister never called at that hour unless something had gone wrong, and something was always going wrong with her. She was crying before I could say hello. Not quiet crying. Loud, breathless sobs that filled my ear and pushed urgency into every word. She told me she had lost everything. The accounts were empty, the cards were maxed, the people she thought were friends were suddenly unavailable. Her voice shook as she said she had nowhere to go. Before I could respond, she added the detail that mattered most. Dad knew. Dad agreed. Dad said I had plenty of space. I sat up in bed, my heart already sinking. It was not the bankruptcy itself that unsettled me. It was the speed with which the decision had been made without me. My house had already been volunteered. I tried to slow the conversation down. I asked what exactly had happened, how long this situation might last, whether there were other options, hotels, short-term rentals, anything that did not involve moving her entire life into my carefully built routine. Each suggestion was met with a sigh, then a sharp edge in her voice. I was being dramatic. I was overthinking. This was family. When I said I needed time to think, she reminded me she was on the verge of breaking. When I mentioned boundaries, she accused me of abandoning her at her lowest point. By the time my father took the phone and spoke calmly about duty and compassion, my resistance felt thin and selfish, even to me. He framed it as temporary, just until she got back on her feet, just until things stabilized. He said I was strong enough to handle it, the way he always did, as if strength meant unlimited capacity. I said yes, not because it felt right, but because saying no felt like lighting a fuse I was not ready to watch burn. She arrived 2 days later. I remember standing in the doorway as she stepped inside, dragging her suitcase behind her like a symbol of finality. There was no gratitude in her expression, no relief, only assessment. She looked around my living room the way someone inspects a rental that does not quite meet their standards. Too quiet, too modest, too controlled. I told myself it was shock, that people behaved strangely when they lost everything. I gave her the benefit of the doubt because that was what I had been trained to do. The first few days were uncomfortable but manageable. She slept late. She watched television while I worked. She talked vaguely about plans she would make once she rested. I adjusted my schedule to accommodate her presence, telling myself it was temporary, just as everyone had promised. But small things began to stand out. She did not ask before using things. She assumed meals would appear. She spoke about the house as if it were shared territory rather than something I had earned inch by inch. When I mentioned job listings or suggested practical steps, she brushed them off with a laugh. She needed time, she said. Pressure was unhealthy. I noticed how quickly the word need replaced the word want. My father checked in often, but never to ask how I was handling the change. His questions were always about her comfort. Was she sleeping well? Did she seem calmer? Was I making sure she did not feel stressed? The message was subtle, but unmistakable. My role was to absorb the disruption quietly. There was one afternoon, about a week in, when I came home earlier than expected and found her on the phone in my kitchen, speaking casually about staying longer than planned. She laughed as she said it, as if it were obvious. When she noticed me, she did not correct herself. She simply smiled and ended the call. That was the first moment I felt real fear, not of her, but of the situation itself. No one had asked how long this would last because, somewhere along the way, it had already been decided. I began questioning myself constantly. Was I being cold? Was I overreacting? Had I misunderstood what family meant? Those doubts did not come from nowhere. They had been planted carefully, reinforced every time my discomfort was labeled selfishness. Still, something inside me resisted. A quiet awareness that helping someone and surrendering your life to them were not the same thing. That awareness did not make me brave. It made me cautious. By the end of that first month, the house no longer felt like a place I returned to for rest. It felt like a space I managed. Every decision carried weight. Every silence carried expectation. The word temporary had vanished completely, replaced by a routine that revolved around her needs and my compliance. One night, as I lay awake listening to footsteps upstairs, I admitted the truth to myself for the first time. This was not a crisis I was helping someone through. This was a trap slowly closing, one I had walked into willingly because I had been taught that refusing was worse than losing myself. I did not know how I would get out yet. I only knew that pretending this was normal was no longer an option. The change was subtle at first, easy to dismiss if I had wanted to protect my own comfort. Nothing dramatic happened overnight. No shouting, no confrontation. Just a quiet shift in the way my house functioned, as if someone had slowly turned the dial without asking. I began waking up earlier, not because I needed to, but because the mornings no longer felt like mine. The kitchen was often already in use, lights on, cabinets open, music playing softly as if the space belonged to someone else. I found myself waiting to make coffee, stepping aside without thinking, adjusting my routine to avoid irritation. It seemed harmless. It wasn't. Little changes stacked on top of each other. My sister rearranged shared spaces with casual authority, moving things because they made more sense to her. She spoke about schedules as if we had agreed on them together. When I hesitated, she laughed and said I was too rigid. That flexibility was important when people were healing. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself I was being generous. What I didn't admit was how quickly I stopped recognizing my own home. She began answering questions for me when people asked about plans. She told neighbors when I would be out of town. She volunteered my space for gatherings without checking first, always framing it as a given. "Claire won't mind," she would say, smiling. And because correcting her felt like creating conflict, I stayed quiet. That silence taught her something. She stopped phrasing things as requests, she assumed. Groceries appeared that I hadn't chosen. Expenses landed on counters without explanation. I would come home and notice decisions had been made while I was gone. Decisions that affected me, my time, my finances, my sense of control. When I asked questions, she brushed them off gently, the way people do when they believe they outrank you emotionally. "You're overthinking," she would say. "This is what family does." The first financial warning sign arrived disguised as convenience. She mentioned she had handled something for me, paid a small fee, taken care of a minor issue that I didn't remember authorizing. It wasn't the amount that unsettled me. It was the assumption that she could act on my behalf without asking. I raised the concern carefully, choosing my words the way I always did. She reacted with surprise, then offense. She reminded me of everything she was going through, how stress affected her judgment, how my tone made her feel unsafe. Within minutes, I was apologizing for bringing it up. Later that night, my father called. He spoke calmly, as if offering guidance. He said I needed to be patient. that my sister was fragile right now, that small inconveniences were a fair price for family stability. He did not ask what had happened. He did not ask how I felt. He told me what was expected, wrapping instruction in reassurance. It struck me then how often decisions about my life were being discussed without me. Conversations were happening elsewhere, conclusions drawn before I ever opened my mouth. I was being informed, not included. The realization did not come with anger. It came with a hollow feeling, like discovering a room in your house you were no longer allowed to enter. I started noticing patterns I had ignored before. The way my sister referenced my father's approval whenever I hesitated. The way my father spoke as if my compliance was proof of character. The way my discomfort was treated as a flaw to be corrected rather than a signal to be respected. There was one afternoon that crystallized everything. I had come home exhausted, mentally drained from a long day, craving quiet. I found the living room rearranged again, not drastically, just enough to feel wrong. Something personal had been moved without care, placed somewhere that stripped it of meaning. It wasn't expensive, it wasn't dramatic, it was mine. I stood there longer than I meant to, staring at it, feeling something inside me go cold. It wasn't about the object, it was about permission, or rather the absence of it. When I mentioned it later, my sister sighed and told me I was making a big deal out of nothing. She said she was just trying to make the space feel more comfortable for both of us. The emphasis on both landed like a quiet claim. That night, I did not sleep well. Not because of noise or tension, but because clarity has a way of keeping you awake. I lay there replaying moments, fitting them together, seeing the shape they formed when viewed honestly. This wasn't generosity being abused accidentally. This was entitlement being exercised confidently. And it was being supported. I thought about how often I had stepped in for others, how often my reliability had been mistaken for availability, how strength in my family had always meant endurance, never choice. By the next morning, something in me had shifted. I didn't announce it. I didn't confront anyone. I simply stopped explaining myself in my own head. I stopped trying to justify why this felt wrong. Instead, I observed. I noticed how quickly my sister deferred to my father when challenged, how his approval reinforced her authority, how the dynamic thrived on my hesitation. The quieter I became, the more confident they grew, mistaking my restraint for surrender. There was a moment, brief and almost unremarkable, when my sister referred to the house as if it were no longer mine alone. She did it casually, without malice, as if the transition were complete and unquestioned. No one corrected her. That was the line. I didn't respond out loud, but internally something clicked into place. If I allowed this to continue, I wouldn't just lose control over my space. I would lose myself inside a role I had never agreed to play. I realized then that waiting for understanding was pointless. Waiting for permission was worse. The only way forward would be quiet, deliberate, and entirely my own. They believed the situation was stable. That belief would become my cover. As I moved through the house that evening, performing the motions expected of me, I felt an unfamiliar calm settle in. Not peace, readiness. The kind that comes when you finally accept that staying silent does not mean staying powerless. If I didn't stop this now, I would lose more than a house. And for the first time since my sister arrived, I knew exactly what that meant. The silence I had been using to protect myself stopped working the moment my father decided to confront me directly. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, the kind that usually passed without notice. I was finishing up work at the dining table when my phone rang, his name lighting up the screen with a weight that made my shoulders tense before I even answered. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. His voice was calm, measured, the tone he used when he believed he was being reasonable. He said we needed to talk, and from the way he said it, I knew this wasn't a conversation. It was a correction. He came over that evening, my sister already aware of it before I was. She acted relaxed, almost bored, as if this were a routine maintenance check rather than an escalation. We sat in the living room, The three of us arranged in a way that felt deliberate. My father positioned where he could see us both, like a judge ready to deliver a ruling. He began by talking about family, about loyalty, about how difficult times revealed character. His words flowed smoothly, practiced, as if he had given this speech many times before, just with different details. He said my sister was still recovering, still fragile, still unable to handle pressure. Then he looked at me and said that meant the responsibility fell to me. Not temporarily, not until she found her footing. He made it clear this was an expectation going forward. I was to manage the situation, to provide stability, to ensure she didn't feel stressed or unsafe. The way he said it erased any illusion that I had a choice. I tried once to speak. I said I was struggling, that the situation was affecting my work, my peace, my sense of control in my own home. He listened without interrupting, then dismissed it with a small shake of his head. He said I was focusing on the wrong things. That discomfort was part of growth. That family required sacrifice. Every word sounded reasonable on the surface. That was the trap. When I mentioned boundaries, he frowned, not in anger but disappointment. He asked when I had become so rigid. He reminded me of everything he had done for me growing up, of the values he had taught me. The message was clear. Disagreeing wasn't just defiance, it was betrayal. I noticed how my sister stayed quiet through most of it, only interjecting occasionally with soft comments that reinforced his point. She talked about how lost she felt, how overwhelmed, how grateful she was to have family who cared. Each sentence placed another invisible weight on my chest. At no point did either of them ask what I needed. The threat came without being spoken outright. My father talked about reputation, about how people remembered who showed up when it mattered. He said families talked, communities talked. He said choices had consequences, and some were difficult to undo. His voice remained steady, but the implication was sharp enough to cut. I understood him perfectly. If I refused, I would be labeled ungrateful, cold, selfish, the problem. I would lose standing, not just with him, but with the extended family that took its cues from him. Resistance meant isolation. I looked at my sister then, really looked at her. She avoided my eyes, but there was no fear in her posture, no uncertainty. She believed this had already been settled. That belief told me everything I needed to know. Something inside me hardened, quietly. I realized this wasn't about helping her recover. It was about assigning me a role that served them both. She needed support. He needed order. And I was the solution because I had always been the one who absorbed impact without complaint. For the first time, I saw the pattern clearly, stretching back years. Every time I had stepped up, it had been framed as strength. Every time I had objected, it had been framed as weakness. Strength in this family meant compliance. When my father finished speaking, he waited. I could feel the expectation in the room, the familiar pause before I usually caved. My sister glanced at me, her expression soft but confident, as if reassuring me that agreeing would make everything easier. I did not give them what they expected. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice or defend myself. I simply nodded once and said I understood. My tone was neutral, almost detached. It was the least dramatic response I could give, and it unsettled them more than anger ever had. My father relaxed immediately, satisfied. He believed the issue resolved. My sister exhaled, the tension leaving her shoulders. In their minds, the order had been accepted. What they couldn't see was the shift that had just taken place inside me. As the conversation wound down and my father prepared to leave, he gave me a look that was meant to be reassuring. He said he knew he could count on me, that I was strong, that this was what family did. I watched him walk out of my house, carrying his certainty with him, and felt something unexpected rise in its place. Not resentment, resolve. That night, after my sister retreated upstairs and the house grew quiet, I sat alone in the living room and let the truth settle. If I stayed, this dynamic would never change. There would always be another justification, another crisis, another reason why my needs came last. I had crossed a line by saying nothing, and they believed it was surrender. They had no idea it was the moment I stopped belonging to the role they had assigned me. I didn't feel angry. I felt clear. For the first time, I understood that explaining myself was pointless. Negotiating was pointless. The only way out of a system built on control was to step outside of it entirely. I turned off the lights, locked the door, and went to bed knowing that the decision I had just made would cost me everything they thought they owned, and I was finally ready to pay that price. The moment my father left that night, I stopped thinking in terms of endurance and started thinking in terms of exit. There was no dramatic shift on the surface. I still washed the dishes, turned off the lights, and went to bed at a reasonable hour. But underneath that routine, something fundamental had changed. I no longer believed this situation could be managed. It could only be escaped. For years, I had been taught that explaining myself was the right thing to do, that if I just found the right words, the right tone, people would understand. That belief had kept me trapped far longer than any argument ever could. Sitting alone in my room, listening to the familiar sounds of my sister settling in upstairs, I accepted the truth I had been avoiding. No explanation would save me here. No one was coming to step in. No one was going to suddenly see me clearly and say this had gone too far. If I wanted out, I would have to build the exit myself. I didn't start with anger. I started with silence and planning. The first thing I did was stop reacting. I answered questions politely. I agreed without enthusiasm. I let my sister believe she had won. The more comfortable she became, the less she paid attention to me. The more confident my father grew, the less he checked in. Their certainty gave me room to breathe. Late at night, when the house finally went quiet, I pulled out my laptop and began opening doors I had quietly prepared long before any of this started. Months earlier, I had begun exploring opportunities beyond my current job, not because I planned to leave, but because I had learned never to rely on a single source of stability. Those late nights, those saved resumes and unfinished applications, became my lifeline. There was one email I kept returning to, rereading it like proof that another reality existed. A role in New York, higher responsibility, higher pay. More importantly, complete independence from the network my family influenced. I had not told anyone about it. I hadn't even allowed myself to fully believe in it until now. I scheduled the interview quietly, taking a long lunch, sitting in my car with the engine off, the city humming faintly around me. I spoke carefully, confidently about my experience, my ideas, my willingness to take on challenges. Not once did I mention my family. For the first time in months, I felt like myself again. While that process unfolded, I started looking at my house differently. I had always thought of it as my sanctuary, the physical reward for years of discipline. But I began to see it as something else, too. Leverage. It was the one thing that kept my family anchored to me, the reason my father felt entitled to issue orders, and my sister felt safe ignoring consequences. As long as the house existed in its current role, I would never truly be free. The thought made my stomach tighten. Selling it felt extreme, almost disloyal, a word that had been used against me my entire life. But loyalty, I was beginning to understand, had only ever flowed in one direction. I confirmed what I already knew. The house was entirely mine. No shared ownership, no hidden obligations. The freedom was there, waiting to be claimed. I reached out to someone I trusted outside my family, someone who existed in a world where boundaries were respected and contracts meant something. I didn't dramatize the situation. I simply asked questions. What were my options? How quickly could things move? What would it take to make a clean break? Each answer made the plan feel more real and more dangerous. During the day, I played the role they expected. I listened to my sister talk about her stress, her exhaustion, her need for comfort. I nodded when my father praised my reliability. I made myself smaller, quieter, easier. They mistook my calm for acceptance. My sister grew more careless. She talked about the future as if it were already mapped out, placing herself firmly in my life without hesitation. My father spoke with the confidence of someone who believed control had been secured. Neither of them noticed the way I had begun sorting my documents, updating passwords, shifting pieces of my life into places they could not reach. Time became my most valuable resource. I started counting days, not out of impatience, but precision. I needed everything to align: the job, the house, my departure. One mistake could collapse the entire plan and leave me more exposed than before. There were moments when doubt crept in, usually late at night. Questions about guilt, about consequences, about whether I was becoming the person they always accused me of being. I let those thoughts come and go without engaging them. Fear had kept me compliant for too long. I wasn't going to let it dictate my future as well. When the offer from New York finally came through, signed and official, I didn't celebrate. I sat quietly and read it twice, then once more, making sure I hadn't imagined it. The relief that followed was sharp and almost painful. For the first time since my sister arrived, I could see a clear path forward. I accepted the offer without hesitation. After that, everything moved faster. Not outwardly. The house still looked the same, the dinners still happened, the conversations followed familiar scripts. But underneath, the timeline was set. I knew exactly how much time I had left in this role, in this house, in this version of my life. One evening, as I stood in the kitchen listening to my sister talk upstairs, I realized something that surprised me. I wasn't afraid anymore, not of confrontation, not of judgment, not even of losing them. They thought they had time. I was already counting days. Once the plan moved out of my head and into motion, everything had to be done quietly. There could be no visible changes, no emotional slips, no sudden defiance that might alert them. I understood that the most dangerous moment wasn't the confrontation itself. It was the period before it, when one wrong move could unravel everything. On the surface, nothing changed. I woke up, went to work, came home, and made polite conversation. I listened when my sister complained about how hard things still felt for her. I nodded when my father reminded me how important stability was right now. I became exactly what they expected me to be: calm, reliable, compliant. Their certainty wrapped around them like armor, and it blinded them. My sister grew increasingly comfortable. She slept later, lingered longer in shared spaces, and spoke freely about plans that assumed my continued presence. She stopped watching her words around me, stopped hiding the entitlement she had once disguised as vulnerability. The more secure she felt, the less she paid attention to what I was doing. That carelessness gave me room. I started handling the practical steps with precision. Documents were gathered quietly and stored where no one would think to look. Accounts were separated. Personal records were moved off shared devices. Passwords were changed late at night, one by one, until my life existed behind doors they didn't even know were there. The house was the hardest part. I walked through each room differently now, not as someone settling in, but as someone preparing to leave. I took note of what mattered and what didn't. The walls that had once felt protective now felt heavy, weighed down by expectations that had nothing to do with me. Letting go of that space wasn't easy, but the clarity was unmistakable. As long as that house anchored my family's dependence, I would never be free. When I took the next step, I did it discreetly. No signs, no conversations overheard. I asked only what I needed to know, framed every question carefully, and moved forward without announcing anything. Each confirmation tightened the timeline, turning an idea into a deadline. The risk sharpened everything. If they discovered what I was doing too early, the consequences would be severe. My father would intervene. My sister would panic. The narrative would shift, and I would be painted as reckless or cruel before I could finish what I started. I couldn't afford that. There was a moment midway through when an unexpected complication threatened to slow things down. For a brief second, doubt surged. I considered postponing, waiting for a safer opening. Then I remembered why waiting was dangerous. Waiting was how I had ended up here in the first place. I pushed forward. An unexpected window opened soon after. My sister became distracted by something unrelated. Her focus pulled elsewhere just long enough for me to move faster without scrutiny. The timing wasn't perfect, but it was sufficient. I adjusted the plan, tightened my focus, and accelerated. At the same time, I prepared myself emotionally. Leaving wasn't just about logistics, it was about severing a role that had defined me for years. I spent nights sitting alone, not reminiscing, but acknowledging what I was giving up. The illusion of harmony, the hope that they might eventually see me differently, the comfort of being needed. I accepted that those things had always come at too high a cost. The final night arrived quietly. No announcement marked it, no dramatic confrontation. My sister was upstairs, absorbed in her own world, unaware that the ground beneath her certainty was already shifting. The house felt strangely hollow, as if it sensed what was coming before anyone else did. I walked through the rooms one last time, not lingering, not sentimental. I touched nothing I wasn't taking with me. I felt no nostalgia, only confirmation. This place had stopped being my sanctuary long before I decided to leave it. When I lay down to sleep, my mind was clear. Not racing, not fearful, just focused. I knew that by the time they realized something was wrong, there would be nothing left to argue about. The decision had already been made, the steps had already been taken. The ending was no longer up for debate. As I closed my eyes, I felt a quiet certainty settle in. By tomorrow, the balance of power would shift in ways they couldn't reverse. And for the first time since this all began, I wasn't reacting to their choices anymore. I was executing my own. The dinner that night looked ordinary to anyone passing by. The table was set, the lights were warm, and the food was familiar. That was the illusion they relied on. Normalcy had always been their strongest weapon, the way they wrapped control in routine and called it family. My father sat at the head of the table, relaxed, confident. My sister ate quietly, scrolling through her phone between bites, completely at ease. She no longer felt the need to perform vulnerability. In her mind, the situation was settled. I had been assigned. I had complied. I watched them both with a calm that surprised even me. There was no anger left in my body, no urge to defend myself. The decision had already been made, and that gave me a strange sense of distance, like I was observing a scene I no longer belonged to. Halfway through the meal, my father cleared his throat. It was a small sound, but it carried authority. He repeated what he had said before, almost casually this time, as if reinforcing a rule everyone already understood. From now on, I was responsible. I would handle things. I would make sure my sister was taken care of. My sister didn't look at me when he said it. She didn't need to. Her confidence filled the space between us. I set my fork down slowly. Not because I needed time, but because I wanted them to notice the shift. When I spoke, my voice was steady, almost gentle. I told them I had something to share. They both looked up, expecting an explanation, maybe a concession. What they didn't expect was how calm I was. There was no apology in my tone, no defensiveness, just information. I said that tomorrow I would be starting a new job in New York. The silence that followed was immediate and heavy. My father frowned, clearly trying to place this new information into the story he thought he was telling. He asked what I meant, his voice sharper now, control slipping at the edges. I repeated myself. New job, new city, immediate start. My sister finally looked at me then, confusion flickering across her face. She laughed lightly as if I had made a joke in poor taste. She said that didn't make sense. I was needed here. We had just talked about this. I nodded once, acknowledging her confusion without engaging it. My father leaned forward, authority returning in force. He told me this was irresponsible, that this was not the time for impulsive decisions, that family obligations came first. He reminded me of everything he had said before, expecting it to land with the same weight. It didn't. I let him finish. Then I added the second piece of information. I told them the house had already been sold. This time, the silence broke. My sister's chair scraped loudly against the floor as she pushed back, disbelief turning into panic in a matter of seconds. She demanded to know what I was talking about, her voice rising, her certainty collapsing. My father stood up, anger flashing across his face, and accused me of lying. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply said it was done. Legally. Completely. He demanded proof. He said I couldn't do that without consulting him, without considering the consequences, without thinking about what it would do to the family. I looked at him and realized something with startling clarity. His authority only existed as long as I recognized it. The moment I stopped responding to it, it dissolved. I told him the decision had already been made, that there was nothing to discuss. My sister began speaking rapidly, anger and fear tangling together. She said I couldn't do this to her, that she had nowhere else to go, that this wasn't fair. Her words tumbled out, desperate now, no longer confident. For a moment I felt the familiar tug of guilt, the instinct to soften the blow. Then I remembered how easily my needs had been dismissed, how quickly my boundaries had been overruled. I let the feeling pass without acting on it. My father tried one last time to regain control. He reminded me of who he was, of what he had done for me, of the consequences of defying him. His voice rose, sharp and commanding, echoing off the walls that no longer belonged to me. I stood up. The movement alone seemed to shock them. I hadn't raised my voice once. I hadn't insulted them. I hadn't justified myself. I simply stood, signaling that the conversation was over. I told them I wished them luck. Then I walked out of the room. Behind me, voices erupted, overlapping, frantic, angry. I didn't turn around. I didn't slow down. I moved through the house with deliberate calm, picking up my keys, my bag, the last things that still needed to come with me. At the door, I paused just long enough to feel the weight of what I was leaving behind. Not the house, not the furniture, the role I had been forced into. The version of myself that had believed endurance was the same as love. I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. The night air felt different, lighter, as if the world had expanded the moment I crossed that threshold. I took a deep breath and felt no regret, only relief. As I walked away, I understood something they never would. They had mistaken my silence for weakness. They had confused my reliability with submission. By the time they realized how wrong they were, it was already too late. The power they thought they held over me had vanished the moment I stopped asking for permission. A few weeks after I walked away from that house, my life became quiet in a way I had never experienced before. Not the hollow quiet that follows conflict, but a steady, grounding silence that let me hear my own thoughts again. I woke up in a small apartment in New York, sunlight slipping through the blinds, no footsteps overhead, no tension waiting for me in the next room. I didn't check my phone first thing in the morning anymore. There were no emergencies to manage, no expectations attached to my name. I made coffee when I wanted to. I worked late because I chose to, not because I was compensating for someone else's chaos. The calm felt unfamiliar at first, almost suspicious, as if I were waiting for something to go wrong. It didn't. News from home reached me slowly, filtered through distant relatives and mutual acquaintances. I never asked for updates, but they found me anyway. Without my house as a safety net, the illusion my family had relied on began to crack. My sister's confidence faded once she had to face reality without someone quietly absorbing the consequences. The comfort she had taken for granted disappeared, replaced by frustration and resentment. My father struggled more than I expected, not because he missed me, but because the structure he depended on no longer existed. I had been the silent support holding things together, and when I stepped away, the imbalance became impossible to ignore. Arguments replaced authority. Blame replaced certainty. The order he had once enforced so easily no longer worked. There was one message that slipped through despite my efforts to keep distance. It was short and carefully worded, asking if we could talk. No apology, no acknowledgement of what had been done. Just an implied hope that I would return to fix what was falling apart. I read it once, then set my phone down. For the first time, I didn't feel torn. I didn't feel cruel. I felt clear. Whatever they were facing now was not something I had caused. It was simply the result of them having to live with the choices they had made once I stopped protecting them from the outcome. My new job demanded focus, and I gave it willingly. I learned names, built routines, earned respect without anyone referencing my family or my past. I wasn't introduced as someone's daughter or someone's sister. I was introduced as myself. That distinction mattered more than I had ever realized. In the evenings, I walked through my neighborhood and felt something settle in my chest that I had been missing for years. Safety. Not the kind that comes from walls or locks, but the kind that comes from knowing no one can walk into your life and rearrange it without your consent. I thought often about the lessons I had learned, not as warnings, but as truths I wished I had understood sooner. Family is not ownership. Love does not require self-erasure. And strength is not measured by how much you can endure in silence. I didn't hate my family. I didn't wish them harm. I simply stopped allowing them access to parts of me they had never respected. That boundary, once set, brought more peace than any argument ever could. There was a strange freedom in realizing that walking away did not make me heartless. It made me honest. Honest about what I could give. Honest about what I could no longer carry. Some evenings I sat by my window and thought about the version of myself who had stayed too long, who had believed patience would eventually be rewarded. I felt compassion for her, not regret. She did the best she could with what she knew at the time. Now, I knew better. I understood that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is disappoint people who are used to benefiting from your sacrifice. Sometimes choosing yourself is not selfish. It's survival. If you're listening to this and parts of it feel familiar, you're not alone. Many of us are raised to believe that responsibility means surrender, and that love must be proven through suffering. That belief keeps too many people trapped in roles they never agreed to play. If you've ever been told it was your duty to carry someone else's life on your shoulders, I hope this story reminds you that you are allowed to step down. You are allowed to choose peace. You are allowed to walk away without explaining yourself one last time. If this resonated with you, I'd love to hear your story. Share it in the comments. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to read today. And if you want to hear more real stories about reclaiming dignity, setting boundaries, and finding the courage to start over, stay with this channel. Subscribe, like, and come back for the next story. Sometimes the quietest exits lead to the strongest new beginnings. This story is fictionalized for dramatic effect.